Did you know that the 1960s was the golden age of American muscle cars? Today we're diving into the top 10 muscle cars from this thrilling decade. Buckle up, because this ride through history is about to get exciting. Number 1. The 1962 Pontiac Catalina Super Duty. Imagine a car so powerful and ahead of its time that it practically kicked off the muscle car craze in America. That's the 1962 Pontiac Catalina Super Duty for you. Back in the day, muscle cars weren't even a thing yet. But here was the Catalina with a 421 cubic inch Super Duty engine and an impressive 405 horsepower. Originally, this car was designed like other full-size vehicles meant for racing, such as Ford Galaxies and Chevy Impalas tearing up the tracks, but Pontiac took it a step further. They equipped some of the Catalina and Grand Prix models with aluminum body panels and hoods to cut down on weight. This meant the car could go even faster. Although less than 200 of these cars were made, their impact was huge. They were a preview of the muscle cars that would soon dominate American roads. Number 2. 1963 Plymouth Savoy Max Wedge. Next up is the 1963 Plymouth Savoy Max Wedge, a standout in the early days of muscle cars. When General Motors was still focused on full-size cars, Chrysler took a bold step by shifting to an intermediate body in 1962. This change was a bit of a scramble. The designs, initially meant for larger cars, ended up looking somewhat oversized and awkward on the smaller bodies. Despite the rocky start, Chrysler quickly got its act together by 1963, especially with the Plymouth models. Under the design leadership of Elwood Engel, Plymouth received a much-needed style upgrade which looked a lot better. On the engineering side, a team led by Tom Hoover in Auburn Hills worked on developing the Max Wedge big block engine. This engine started as a 413 cubic inch powerhouse in 1962 and was upgraded to 426 cubic inches by 1963, pumping out an impressive 425 horsepower. What made the Max Wedge even more special was its pairing with the industry's first 3-speed automatic transmission. This combination made the Plymouth Savoy Max Wedge a nearly unbeatable force on the racetrack. Around 250 of these Max Wedge Plymouths were built in 1963, making them quite rare today. But despite their performance and appeal, these Max Wedge cars were generally not available to the average buyer. Number 3. 1964 Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt. Let's talk about the 1964 Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt, a muscle car that packs a serious punch. Back in the early 60s, Ford was pushing its full-size Galaxy 500 on NASCAR tracks and drag strips. While the Galaxy was fast with its 427 cubic inch big block FE engine, it just wasn't enough to keep up with the competition. So Ford's answer was the Fairlane Thunderbolt. This car was based on the mid-size Fairlane platform introduced in 1962, but with some serious muscle under the hood. The Thunderbolt used a high-output version of the 427 cubic inch engine, which blasted out 425 horsepower at 6,000 RPM. Ford only made 100 Thunderbolts in 1964, splitting them nearly evenly between manual and automatic transmissions. Even though NASCAR banned them for their extreme mods, these cars didn't just sit around. They tore up the drag strips and snagged the 1964 NHRA Superstock Championship. Number 4. 1965 Pontiac GTO Tri-Power. Now we'll dive into the story of the 1965 Pontiac GTO Tri-Power, a car that really shook up the muscle car world. Back in 1964, Pontiac introduced the GTO trim on their mid-size Le Mans cars. This was a bold move because they totally ignored General Motors restrictions, which capped engine sizes in mid-size cars at 330 cubic inches. Pontiac went big and it paid off. The GTO blew up in popularity, and by 1965 it was leading the muscle car pack. The Tri-Power version with its 3 carburetors was the star of the show. This setup cranked the engine's power up to 360 horsepower, making it a beast on the road. But the 65 GTO wasn't about raw power. It also got some serious upgrades that year. Better brakes, tougher shocks, a stronger anti-sway bar, and more muscle in the base engine, now hitting 335 horsepower. Thanks to all these upgrades, sales more than doubled from the previous year, with 75,342 GTOs flying off the lots. The 1965 GTO is remembered not just for its power, but for kicking the muscle car craze into high gear. Number 5. 1966 Dodge Coronet Street Hemi. Let's jump to 1965 when Pontiac decided to shake up the muscle car world with the GTO Tri-Power. Back in '64, they launched the GTO on the mid-size Le Mans and completely ignored GM's engine size limits. They went past the 330 cubic inch limit, and it turned out to be a genius move. This car quickly became a standout with its Tri-Power setup, 3 carburetors boosting it to a whopping 360 horsepower. It also got major upgrades like better brakes, stronger shocks, which made it fast and reliable. All these upgrades paid off big time. Sales more than doubled, skyrocketing to over 75,000 GTOs sold that year. It's a classic example of how breaking the rules can sometimes lead you to victory lane. Number 6, 1968 AMC AMX. In 1968, American Motors, or AMC, finally jumped into the muscle car scene. Before this, AMC was all about family cars. They even led the push for smaller cars in the US, which accidentally helped kick off the muscle car craze. By the time they realized what was happening, they were behind in the game. So, AMC decided it was time to catch up. They rolled out the Javelin and the even cooler AMX, designed by Dick Teague. These cars were AMC's way of taking on the big guys like Ford's Mustang and Chevy's Corvette. The AMX was a sleek 2-seater, priced more like the Mustang than the pricey Corvette, making it a great deal for young folks looking for speed and style. The top AMX model in 1968 came with a 390 cubic inch engine that put out 315 horsepower. It was also light, weighing just 3,000 pounds, which meant it could really move. This car wasn't just fast, it was a steal, offering top-notch performance without emptying your wallet. Launching the AMX was a smart move for AMC. It kept their tradition of offering great value alive, just like they did with the Rambler Americans 5 years earlier. This time, though, they were also hitting the mark with the cool young crowd. Number 7, 1969 Chevy COPO 427 cubic inch Camaro. Talking about 60s muscle cars and not mentioning the Camaro? Impossible. But not just any Camaro. The 1969 COPO Camaro is where it's at. COPO stands for Central Office Production Order, a system meant for outfitting non-performance cars with special equipment. But some clever dealerships use this system to sneak Chevy's biggest engines into their lightest cars, turning them into factory-built supercars. COPO Camaro packed a 427 cubic inch Chevy big block V8, an engine usually reserved for the high-end Corvettes and big Chevys. Back in '69, you weren't supposed to put such a big engine in a small car like the Camaro, but the COPO program was a game changer. There were actually 2 types of COPO 427 Camaros made. The first was the COPO 9561, had a solid lifter L72 iron block, and around 4,275 units were built. The second, the COPO 9560, was even more special with an aluminum ZL1 427 cubic inch big block, but only 69 of these were made. And back in '69, you could get a Camaro with a V75 code, which is basically a secret weapon for burnouts. It was a liquid tire chain option that sprayed a traction aid onto the rear tires, allowing for epic burnouts. At least one of these was added to a COPO Camaro. Dealers like Yanko, Fred Gibb, and Berger sold these beasts, making any COPO Camaro a dream find for muscle car enthusiasts. Number 8. 1969 Ford Boss 429 Mustang. Let's dive into the 1969 Ford Boss 429 Mustang, one of the most hardcore muscle cars out there. Now, some people might argue that pony cars like the Mustang aren't true muscle cars, but the Boss 429 is in a league of its own. Originally, this beast wasn't meant just to cruise the streets, but was a secret weapon for NASCAR. When production of the Boss 429 Mustang kicked off in March 1969, it was clear that this car was going to be rare. Only 859 were made in 1969 and just 499 more in 1970. The engine was officially rated at 375 horsepower, but it didn't take much to unlock even more power from it. The 1969 model's hydraulic cam was swapped out for a mechanical tappet in 1970. Also, the Mustang's engine bay was too narrow for the massive Boss 429 engine, so the cars had to be sent out to Carcraft in Brighton, Michigan for some serious modifications before they could receive their Hemi engines in special performance gear. This makes the Boss 429 Mustang not just a powerful muscle car, but a unique piece of automotive history. Number 9. 1969 Dodge Hemi Daytona. The late 1960s were a wild time for Detroit's horsepower wars, and Dodge decided to go all in with the 1969 Hemi Daytona. This was a time when baby boomers were coming of age, space technology was booming, and cheap fuel was everywhere. Racing, whether on drag strips or NASCAR tracks, was huge. Dodge came up with a bold move to dominate NASCAR. They built over 500 of these special Dodge Chargers to sell to the public, making the Daytona one of the most iconic muscle cars of the 60s. Imagine a car with a nose cone designed in a wind tunnel and huge rear wing that looked like it belonged on a jet fighter, not a family car. Number 10. 1970 Chevelle SS 454. Moving from the high-flying theatrics of the 1969 Dodge Hemi Daytona, let's hit the streets with another legend, the 1970 Chevelle SS 454. This muscle car powerhouse comes from the General Motors midsize A-body platform featuring the Chevy Malibu. By 1970, the Chevelle SS had climbed to the top of the muscle car popularity charts and stayed there for decades. Chevy dropped a massive 454 cubic inch big block engine into the Chevelle in 1970, creating a muscle car that could dominate both the road and the heart of any car enthusiast. This monster engine came in two flavors, a solid 360 horsepower LS5 and the jaw-dropping 450 horsepower LS6. It packed solid lifters, cowl induction, and a high compression ratio, making it the most powerful production car at the time. But they only made 4,475 of the LS6 version in 1970, and thanks to a quirky GM decision in 1968, the SS wasn't its own model anymore, but a trim on the Malibu. This makes figuring out if a Chevelle SS is the real deal pretty tricky post-1969. You need old dealership papers or broadcast sheets to confirm their authenticity. And that's a wrap on our tour of the top 1960s American muscle cars. If you liked the video, hit the subscribe button to keep up with our content. Leave a comment below about which muscle cars we should cover next. Thanks for watching.